Hi, I'm Brian E. Denton, author of the book A Year of War and Peace and the poetry collection Inspiration. Welcome to my channel. This video is another in a series of videos I'm doing on Dante's Divine Comedy. These videos are inspired by Baylor University's project 100 Days of Dante. The 100 Days of Dante project is Baylor University's attempt to cultivate a global readership of Dante's Divine Comedy and read through the entire epic poem at a rate of 3 cantos or chapters per week. I think this is a great idea, and this is my independent contribution to it. Now, each video has 3 parts. There's this introduction, then there's a part called the synopsis, where I will cover the plot, the characters, and the themes of each canto. Today's canto is Canto 5. And then in the third part, I call this the takeaways, and this is where I offer my personal analysis. Before we get started, I'd just like to thank everyone for subscribing. I asked viewers to help me get to 100 subscribers before the end of the week, and we hit that goal. I really hope that the content I produce for everyone is well worth your time. I do, however, have a new goal, and that's to reach 150 subscribers before the end of September. So if you'd like to help me, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel and to like as many videos as possible. All right, and with that, let's get into it. Dante's Inferno, Canto 5. Dante descends into the next ring of hell, and right away, he's made more aware that there is a greater sense of agony and a more profound lamentation down here than there was up in limbo. He sees before him the snarling, terrible Minos. Now, just let me say as a quick note that there were many different pronunciations available to me of this guy's name on the internet, and I went with Merriam-Webster, Minos. I'm sure I'm wrong. Let me know down in the comments. But anyway, just like in Greek mythology, where Minos comes from, Dante again with the pagan imagery, Minos is the judge of the underworld, or more accurately here, the judge of hell. Although he's probably better characterized as an administrator of hell, because after all, it's God who judges, and God who decides who goes to paradise, purgatory, or hell. At any rate, Minos hears the confessions of a seemingly inexhaustible line of sinners awaiting their punishment, and he communicates the appropriate level of hell that they belong to by wrapping his giant tail around his body that number of times. So, for instance, if you, the sinner, belong in the 4th level of hell, Minos is going to wrap his giant tail around his body 4 times. Now, what happens next is that Minos notices that Dante is trying to get admission to hell. He also notices, of course, that Dante is a living soul rather than a dead soul, so he gets upset. Dante is not supposed to be here. But Virgil sets Minos straight, and Minos eventually lets them both continue down into the 2nd ring of hell. The first impression down here is that everything is devoid of light. Dante once again has to rely on his other senses. Here, he's going to rely on his auditory sense. And what he hears is a hellish squall and screams of agony. This squall, this tempest that Dante hears is very important because it's the source of the sinner's punishment in this canto. That punishment is this. These sinners are constantly and rudely tossed about by a strong wind that pitches them back and forth like so much newspaper refuse on a city street. They're just constantly careening about throughout the air with no rest whatsoever. And there's lots of these people. Dante asks who these people are. Virgil tells him that these are the poor souls who gave in to lust and lechery in their lives, and now they're being punished for it. And he also points out a whole bunch of historical figures belonging to this particular ring of hell. We got Semiramis, Helen, Paris, Cleopatra, Dido. At this point, Dante asks if any of these swirling souls would like to speak with him. One of them answers Dante's call. It's a woman, and she calls Dante very kind for coming to visit her and for asking after her story. And her story she shares with Dante. Her story is this. During her life, she fell in love with this man, and this man fell in love with her. And the love they had was very strong. So strong, in fact, that it endures even in the afterlife. For the man that she's in love with is now with her down in the 2nd ring of hell, swirling about in the squall above. But her earthly love wasn't strong enough, because it couldn't keep them both from being murdered. Virgil then asks Dante what he thinks about the story, and Dante responds, "It's awful. I'm full of pity." This is a pattern. Lots of pity coming from Dante so far in this poem. Keep that in mind moving forward, because the pity he feels is going to be relevant later on in the poem. Next, Dante calls this woman by her name. That's odd, because she didn't introduce herself by name yet. But Dante knows that her name is Francesca. We'll talk a little bit later about how Dante knows that her name is Francesca, but for now just know that he calls her by her name and that he tells her that he weeps for her and wants to know By what signs did love acquaint her with her hesitant desires? Francesca tells Dante that the lust between the two of them was kindled over reading a book together, and that book was Lancelot's Romances. And the power of the story was so strong that they just couldn't help but get it on. And with that, Dante, overcome by pity at Francesca's story, passes out. Again. Let's talk about characters and themes. Now, there's only really two characters that you need to know anything about in this canto. And those two characters, of course, are Francesca and her lover, Paolo. Now, the story told in this canto of their love is very spare. There's not a lot of details. And I think the reason for that is that Dante would have assumed that Paolo and Francesca's story were widely known among his readership. And the reason that they were widely known among his readership is because they were famous. And they were famous because they were murdered. Now, also note the use of historical figures in the poem. In this case, Francesca and Paolo. This is going to be important moving forward because throughout the Divine Comedy, you'll see that Dante includes a lot of his contemporaries within the poem. So, Francesca is the daughter of the Lord of Ravenna, and the Lord of Ravenna marries Francesca off to the Lord of Rimini, Giovanni Malatesta. And this is a political union. It's a political marriage. It's not a marriage of love. As it happens, Francesca does end up falling in love with Giovanni's brother, Paolo. And Paolo appears in this canto too. He's the one who Francesca refers to as having a fair form. But things don't really work out too well for Paolo and Francesca because they're soon found out by Giovanni, who murders them, thus sending them off to be blown about by the winds in the second ring of hell for all eternity. Moving on to themes. The theme of this canto, of course, is love. In fact, the word love, amor or amore, appears 10 times in this canto alone. In the entire poem of the Inferno, that word occurs 20 times. So half the times it occurs, it's in this canto. Love is the theme of this canto. Now, there are many different types of love, of course, so it's important to focus on exactly what type of love is meant here in Canto 5. The general consensus is that we're dealing with love as it manifests itself in the form of lust. Exactly what I mean by that we'll be getting into in a few moments in the takeaway section. So I'll conclude this section by talking a little bit about what the contrapasso means in this section. The contrapasso punishment in this ring of hell is that all sinners are, as we've seen, constantly blown about by a wild and tumultuous wind, and they're totally at the mercy of these winds. So recall, the contrapasso is the punishment for sinners that is both similar to and yet opposite from the sin that provoked it. So this punishment of being blown around by the wind is similar to the sinner's sin because in both cases the sinner has lost control of themselves. They've lost control of their emotions by losing themselves to lust in their earthly life, and now they've lost control of themselves in the afterlife by being blown about by this wind. But the punishment is opposite to the sin in the respect that they're unable to consummate this love in the afterlife, whereas they were able to do it during their earthly life. One more note on love in this poem, not just this canto, but the poem. If you've been reading carefully, you've noticed that the idea of love has been expressed on a few occasions before this. In fact, we encountered it for the first time way back in the first canto, when Dante writes that God's love lights up the worthy things on top of the mountain. The word also appears in the first canto when Dante expresses his great love of Virgil's poetry. These are all platonic loves, but there's one instance of love in the poem, and it occurs in the second canto, that can be construed as a type of romantic love similar to the one that Francesca and Paolo have. And that, of course, is the love that Beatrice expresses for Dante. Remember in Canto 2, it's Beatrice who implores Virgil to act as guide for Dante and bring him up into heaven. And the reason that she implores him to do this is that she loves Dante. And remember, from the Vita Nuova, is that love was romantic. Beatrice and Dante had a romantic relationship. So again, this is a romantic love. It's different from the platonic love that appears as God's love or Dante's love of Virgil's poetry. This whole narrative then of the entire Divine Comedy could very possibly be born out of the idea of romantic love. Because without Beatrice asking Virgil to help Dante, then Dante's still down in the dark wood trying to figure out how best to fight off the she-wolf, the leopard, and the lion. So, as Professor Berolini of Columbia University says, romantic love can either lead to eternal life, like in the case of Beatrice, or eternal death, as in the case of Francesca. So anyway, the bottom line is that romantic love need not always lead to lust and eternal damnation, which is what we're going to be getting into a little bit deeper in the takeaways, which we go to now. Canto 5 has typically been read as a warning against the ravages of lust in general and of fornication in particular. And this is a reasonable position to have, and in fact, many moralists throughout the centuries have argued its merits. On the other hand, it's also reasonable to claim that Dante might be up to something else entirely here. It might be that he's not writing against the physical act of lust, the sexual act, but rather he's more worried about the negative effect lust's passion unleashes on the human mind, and how this is what separates them from God. There are a few things that point in this direction. First, we see quite clearly that fornication is not what's being punished here. Just look at lines 37 through 39. Dante writes, "I understood that to such torment the carnal sinners are condemned, they who make reason subject to desire." So again, it's not necessarily sex that Dante is concerned with here. For Dante, the sin these sinners committed was not necessarily sexual in nature. The sin they committed was allowing their God-given gifts of reason to be subjected to and subverted by desire. If the physical act of sex was what was being punished here, then we would expect the contrapasso to include some form of genital mutilation, but that's not what's happening here. And indeed, that would never happen in a piece of classical art or literature.
This shit was unseemly, man.
But no, thankfully that's not what's happening in the contrapasso in this canto. The sinners in this ring of hell are not having their genitals destroyed or mutilated forever. Instead, their bodies are lost in a perpetual tempest, just as their souls were in life, as they were consumed by the evils of their lusts. Readers of this canto, then, will naturally ask themselves a few questions. Is it fornication that condemns these sinners? Or is their sin that they allowed their lusts and their emotions to override their God-given natural reasoning faculties? And if that's the case, does this mean that true freedom lies not in any vulgar libertinism or sexual license, but rather in liberation from the harnessing chains of our beastly impulses? That question aside, it's also quite natural for readers of this canto to consider how best to avoid falling prey to the same impulses that Francesca and Paolo did, lest they find themselves hurled about in a hurricane for all eternity. Interestingly enough, a decent answer to this question appears in one of English language's greatest pieces of literature, on speaking, of course, of Lawrence Stern's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. Now, if you haven't read this book, pause the video. Go and read it. You're gonna love it. Okay, back? Good. Let me know what you thought about Tristram Shandy down in the comments. But first, let's talk about how he can help us avoid Francesca and Paolo's fate. As I'm positive you remember from the book, Tristram Shandy has been subject to all manner of misadventures and misunderstandings and comedic tragedies in his life. So when his brother Bobby dies and he comes into the Shandy inheritance, he naturally starts to think about what an ideal world would look like and what an ideal realm for him to rule would look like. And he settles on a realm full of subjects who are both merry and wise. Now, how to become merry and wise? Well, Tristram's idea is similar to Dante's of disallowing reason to be subject to desire. Tristram would want his people to curb their passions, because they are the source of all the misadventures, misunderstandings, and comedic tragedies that he's experienced in his life. Shandy says, "Nothing but a habit of virtue can fully govern those passions and subject them to reason." So what is a good way for us to practice these habits of virtue that Tristram Shandy would have us do? Well, this brings us to our second takeaway from Canto 5, and that takeaway is this. We should never engage in blame shifting. We should always internalize our problems. We should never externalize them. We should consider every fault to be our own, even if it's not. We shouldn't be like Francesca here. I mean, look at her. She blames everyone but herself for her sin. First, she says that love controls her. She doesn't control love. She blames Paolo's devastating good looks. She blames her husband's poor behavior. She blames the overwhelming and intoxicating nature of French romance novels. Fair. Don't be like Francesca, because if you blame all your problems on other people, you're never going to be able to solve them for yourself. Be instead a judicious self-judge of your actions and your character, as Epictetus would have it. From this day forward, then, whenever we do anything wrong, we will ascribe the blame only to the judgment from which we act. and we will endeavor to remove and extirpate that with greater care than we would abscesses and tumors from our body. Of these judgments, we ourselves, and not externals, are the masters. The third takeaway is that it's important to pay attention to the use of the repetition of language in the entire poem, not just the Inferno, but the Divine Comedy itself. Now, we've already discussed the repetition of Dante's use of amor in this canto, but there was another repetition that perhaps could be more important. It's more subtle, and it involves a callback to Canto 1. Did you catch it? If you're thinking of Dante's use of the expression di nostra vita, our life, then you are indeed a keen reader, and I applaud you. Remember, that's the expression that opens up the poem, but it also occurs here in this canto in lines 69 through 72. Now, in both cases, di nostra vita is used as an expression when Dante is in a distraught state. In the first canto, he's distraught over being lost in the dark wood, and he's distraught here while he's listening to Francesca's story. What are we to make of this, that Dante universalizes this feeling twice in the poem? Is it perhaps that the sin that set him off the straight path at the beginning back in Canto 1 is the same sin that is now afflicting Francesca and her lover Paolo? What do you think? Let me know down in the comments below. All right, that concludes my video for Canto 5 of Dante's Inferno. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, and there's every reason to assume that you did, otherwise you wouldn't have made it all the way through this video, I'd ask that you first like this video and then subscribe to the channel. Remember that I'm trying to get to 150 subscribers by the end of September. I think it's totally achievable, and I thank you in advance for your help. In addition to liking the video and subscribing to the channel, it's also important, indeed it's more important, to get a conversation going. So, in the comments below, let me know what you think about this canto and the poem in general, and also what you think about what I think about the poem and the cantos. I've asked a series of questions throughout the video. Feel free to answer those. And in addition, I got two more questions, two more things that I'd like to talk about and hear your opinion on. And that is this. Number one, what do you make of the use of birds in this canto? You'll recall that there's 3 similes, and all 3 include the use of birds. They're all bird similes. What do you make of that? And number 2, who do you agree with in this poem? Dante the Pilgrim or Dante the Poet? Recall that Dante the Pilgrim is very upset at Francesca's story. In fact, he becomes overwhelmed by pity and he passes out. So clearly he's skeptical at least that she doesn't belong in hell. But Dante the Poet, the one writing the Divine Comedy, obviously he does believe that Francesca belongs in hell because that's where she is in this canto. So again, do you think that Francesca belongs in hell, like Dante the Poet, or do you believe that she's innocent, like Dante the Pilgrim? In addition to leaving your comments here on YouTube, you should know that I'm also on Twitter at Brian E. Denton. And aside from that, I'll be releasing these videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Our next video is going to be on Monday. Until then, take care of yourselves and others. But Dante the Poet's different. He includes Francesca in his hell. Is that how I'm pronouncing? Francesca.